In March 1815, Anthony Baker, a veteran British diplomat, was tidying up some final business related to the treaty that brought to a close to what was the Second War between Britain and its former American colonies. Having been negotiated in Europe in the town of Ghent, the treaty was ratified first by Britain and then carried to the United States by Baker. Congress quickly approved the treaty, but James Monroe, then Secretary of State and the next U.S. President, had castigated Baker on multiple occasions for the order in which the two countries' names and signatures had appeared on the treaty. So Britain and then the United States. Although Baker pled that no insult had been intended by Britain, Monroe remained unsatisfied, and he proceeded to give Baker a final stern lecture on the subject, knowing that it would be conveyed verbatim to America's former colonial masters. Ignoring the fact that the United States had barely escaped a disastrous war with the world's foremost military power, Monroe brazenly declared that, and this is from his remarks, the United States have acquired a certain rank amongst nations, which is due to their population and political importance. And they do not stand in the same situation as at former periods. The United States, Monroe made clear, would be the subordinate of no nation, either in practice or in form. Now, Monroe's comments demonstrated once again that the American government, what it lacked in terms of bite, it made up in terms of bark. There was never any doubt that the U.S. would accept the treaty. In fact, it had already been ratified by the time Monroe made those remarks. After all, the British had tens of thousands of troops already in Canada. They were amassing more in Britain. They had naval supremacy in the Atlantic, a strangling blockade along the entire Atlantic seaboard. And things were looking very grim for the United States, which meanwhile had defaulted on its national debt the previous November. Its navy was bottled up in port, and it had not paid most of its army for almost a year. Yet Monroe wasn't really being obtuse. He spoke with the conviction of a young nation that had gone to war largely because its senior peers were not giving it the esteem its leaders believed it deserved. Thus, my interpretation of the War of 1812, which I'd like to share with you today, is that it was at least in part about America's grand attempt to compel Europe to take the United States seriously as a sovereign European-styled nation. But at the same time, the war was also Britain's concerted effort to keep the United States under the umbrella of British authority. Hello, I'm Troy Bickham, and I'm a professor of history at Texas A&M University, and I'm also the author of the book, The Weight of Vengeance, the United States, the British Empire, and the War of 1812. Now, sometimes labeled by scholars as a forgotten war, the War of 1812 has been overlooked in the more general histories of the U.S. and is virtually ignored by historians of Britain and its empire. The exception is Canada, where the War of 1812 is enshrined in national mythology as the moment Canada ensured its independence from its aggressive neighbor to the south. Now, to be fair, at first glance, the War of 1812 is kind of easy to dismiss. By contemporary standards, it was fairly short and bloodless. It lasted a mere 2.5 years and resulted in just short of 4,000 combat deaths. By contrast, Britain's concurrent wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France lasted over 2 decades and resulted in millions of deaths. In consequence, the War of 1812 has largely drawn the attention of military historians, most interested in the strategic, political, and military narrative and its long-term consequences for the U.S. Armed Forces. Finding far more fertile ground in the Napoleonic Wars, British military historians and historians in general have scarcely seriously looked at the conflict at all. But this doesn't really convey the full picture of either the conflict or its wider importance. The way I'd like to approach today's topic is to look at it this way. is to ask the question, who won the War of 1812? And consequently, who cared about what at first glance appeared to be a peripheral conflict of a Eurocentric world? Now, it's relatively easy to identify the conflict's losers. Native Americans from the Iroquois to the Creek had steadily suffered as both the US and the British and Canada steadily eroded their political autonomy and acquired their lands. Tecumseh, for example, seen here, was one of the more notable people who offered resistance, particularly in the north, but alongside Tecumseh were a number of peoples, including notably in the south, the Creek Red Sticks. Now they resisted, but then they found themselves essentially a part of a coalition of losers from the war. The repercussions for these groups were severe. Tecumseh lost his life, right? And the Creek Indians, whether they had supported the rebelling Red Sticks or not, lost large portions of territory. Most important, the U.S. was largely free after the War of 1812 to pursue its Indian policies, which was essentially eradication and removal without fear of reprisal from Britain. Enslaved Africans, too, were losers from the war, albeit more indirectly, in that by making the American Indian obstacle to westward expansion easier to move, the War of 1812 allowed the expansion of slavery. The War of 1812 also squashed British and international American opposition, internal American opposition to the legally questionable Louisiana Purchase of 1803. More environs for the expansion of slavery. And let's not also forget that the War of 1812 left the remnants of the Spanish Empire already vulnerable from years of conflict related to the Napoleonic Wars at the mercy of the United States. Within a generation, the U.S. formally acquired Florida, and then it proceeded to mop up the rest by occupying and then seizing much of what is now the American West and Texas. All territories Americans had been eyeing well before the War of 1812. The winners of the war are a lot harder to identify. And this is what I'd like to spend the rest of my time discussing. On the surface, it would be relatively easy to simply declare that there wasn't a winner. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, concluded in what's called a status quo ante bellum. And that's a fancy way or a Latin way of saying the British and American governments agreed to return everything to its pre-war status. This included any lands they conquered, they handed back. And they were meant to send it right back to the way things were just before the war. And no formal victory is declared, there's no reparations or anything like that. So it's a relatively short and simple treaty. Now, most historians have been satisfied with this. But as I tell my students, good history is about digging deeper than the surface, and the truth is often more subtle, more conflicted, and a lot more ambiguous than the boldly printed words of a treaty. Now, to determine a victor, we need to look at the agendas of both the U.S. and Britain. Now, the American agenda was fairly clear. At least President James Madison clearly stated it. The United States was not being treated as a sovereign nation on a par with other sovereign nations, particularly European sovereign nations. These violations with regard to Britain were most evident, according to Madison, in Britain's interference with American overseas trade and in how Britain regarded the legal status of American citizens. There were, of course, other cards that Madison played in this suit, but none carried the strength of formal conviction as these 2 points. These were the core of the nation's complaints in the years preceding the war. So, looking at trading rights. Now, disagreements over American neutral trading rights stretched back to 1793, which is when revolutionary France and Britain went to war. From then until the War of 1812, the two countries were at war, except for a very short intermittent peace. And the United States proceeded to squabble with both France and Britain alike. They even conducted an undeclared, what was called a quasi-war against France from 1798 to 1800. Yet because elements within France and Britain benefited enormously from American trade, it was all largely allowed to continue even though both sides were at war. And in fact, it flourished and enriched Americans. The United States provided agricultural products to a Europe whose young men had given up the plow for the sword, but also, and more controversially, the Americans began to profit from taking over shipping, right? Or what was at the time called the carrying trade between France and its colonies, particularly in the Caribbean. Essentially what was happening is the American ships would take products from French colonies to France and French products to their colonies. And because the French couldn't really do this stuff, because the Royal Navy, the British Navy, had naval supremacy and would kind of blow those ships or capture those ships out of the water. So the Americans sort of intervened into this. Now, American ships took over an ever-increasing share of the trade also between British and the French empires. Because they were at war, the Americans could kind of trade and handle trade between the two places. Because American neutrality in the war meant that they had access to both markets. Neutrality also protected American ships from European navies and privateers, which resulted in a lower insurance rates for American ships because people aren't trying to capture them and they could proceed as normal. What this meant was that American ships ultimately began to undercut British merchants and British shipping, trading between British goods within the British markets of its own empire. As a result, American merchants went from sending their first ship to India in 1784 to exceeding all European nations' carrying trade or shipping trade with South Asia just over a decade later. By 1810, the American merchant fleet's tonnage had reached 1.25 million tons, making it second only to the world's leader, which was Britain. The official value of American exports ultimately peaked at $108 million in 1807. But critically, only half of these exports were actually goods that were produced in America. The vast majority were, in fact, foreign goods. Because as the British and the French kind of put screws on each other, what the Americans would do is they would float over to a French colony, pick up all the French stuff, float back to America, unload it, reload it on another ship, and then transport it to France. And in the process, those French goods became American. Essentially, it was a vast, complex laundering scheme that both sides kind of turned a blind eye to because they needed each other's goods. And the Americans made out like bandits. In fact, the value of foreign goods funneled this way through the U.S. increased by 120-fold between 1790 and 1807. Now, when you realize that we're talking about a time in which was kind of lots of numbers bandied about here, but we're talking about a time when the entire revenue for the U.S. government in 1810 was $13.5 million, right? So they were making 4 times that much in this kind of laundering of goods scheme. So it's a huge amount of the American economy. From 1806, however, the situation became increasingly complicated and precarious. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken over the French Revolution and declared himself emperor, had won a series of sweeping victories that made France the master of much of Europe, while Britain had firmly established supremacy at sea. So they couldn't really fight each other. The British had supremacy at sea, so they had a great navy. The French had a great army, but they couldn't really go to each other. So what they did is they kind of declared economic war on each other, and hoping to win a war of attrition. Napoleon issued a series of decrees that effectively declared France's right to seize any neutral ship that was caught trading with Britain. And Britain did the same with the like-intentioned series of orders, what are often referred to as the Orders in Council. Not to be outdone, then President Thomas Jefferson responded by declaring an embargo and saying the United States would not trade with either of them. And he was hoping to kind of bully France or Britain into relenting. So in this game of chicken, which is depicted in this cartoon, and Britain and France are taking turns drowning themselves, all the parties are suffering. But the U.S. is the first to flinch. And this is because during the first year of Jefferson's embargo, Massachusetts merchants alone lost $15 million in freight revenues. And again, that's more than what the federal government brought in that previous year. Nationally, the total value of American exports declined by 80% in the first year, and this was devastating. And so not surprisingly, the U.S. quickly repealed the embargo and went back to the negotiating table, but with very little success. And so by 1811, Madison, who had become president, was under tremendous pressure from within his own party, which also had a majority in Congress, to do something, because they realized that Britain, which was primarily the one interfering with all this because they're the ones with the Navy, isn't going to yield. So now moving on to the next major complaint of the Americans, the issue of impressment. Now, America's ability to grow its fleet so rapidly depended heavily on its ability to drain sailors from British ships. They offered better conditions and pay, and American ships proceeded to attract British sailors in the tens of thousands. The Royal Navy responded by boarding American merchant ships and starting to seize sailors it claimed were British and pressing them into service in the Royal Navy. Now, to be clear, impressment was an age-old form. The British have been doing this for centuries, and it basically said that it's like a form of a draft. The British government gave the right to the Royal Navy to go around, and if they needed sailors, to grab sailors off the street or off other ships and force them to serve in the Navy. Well, the problem was, of course, is that they're now boarding American ships, and American ships, of course, are under American flags and sovereign nations. So in the summer of 1807, this really reached a peak, because the Royal Navy went so far as to pull up to a U.S. warship, the Chesapeake, and fire upon it in order to retrieve 4 deserters from the Royal Navy. The attack resulted in the death of 4 U.S. sailors and wounded a further 17. Now, while the Chesapeake affair really kind of agitated the Americans and aroused a real public fury in the United States, the opposition to actual British impressment itself was generally in America kind of lukewarm. Now, some politicians and newspaper editors made a big deal about it and kind of pitied the sailors and so on. But Americans in landlocked states like Kentucky didn't really care about the woes of sailors. It wasn't on their radar. They're more interested in trade. Nor did the prudish American New England elite who looked at British sailors as a class, or sailors in general as a class of people who are best known for their fondness of alcohol, prostitutes, and gambling. So not really sympathetic to that particular group, at least not enough to go to war over. You know, besides, most of the men who were pressed from American ships were really British, including the 4 deserters they pulled off the Chesapeake. Now, what most provoked the ire of Americans, really, was the high-handedness with which the British government and Navy handled the entire affair. American sensitivity to being a post-colonial society should not be underestimated. This was, after all, a time when Americans were constantly reminded of their cultural inferiority. Whether it was the maps that placed Europe at the center, or the library books, the libraries that were packed with English books, or fashions that came from Europe, or just simply the surgical instruments that they used, they were very, had a chip on their shoulder about not being necessarily as culturally, supposedly advanced as their European counterparts. After 1807, with the Orders in Council, the British attempted now to unilaterally draw a line with how, when, what, and where the Americans could trade. The British ultimately, with impressment, also started to decide unilaterally who was or was not an American. To put it in rather simplistic terms, whereas the Americans widely held that citizenship was an inalienable right of choice, at least for free adult white men with some property, the British held that subjects of the king were once and forever subjects, what contemporaries referred to in legal terms as indefeasible allegiance. Now, what that meant essentially is that, from an American perspective, is that the king wasn't giving up his rights on his former subjects, and that king seen here was the very same George III who was king during the American Revolution. This was the grounds on which the American Revolution had been fought. In other words, the Declaration of Independence asserted Americans' right to break allegiance with one country and form a new national allegiance. The British king had asserted there was no such right. And the Americans had won that war, and the British king was forced to recognize it. So now we're in a situation in which Britain's backtracking on this. Because so whereas Americans recognize the right of expatriation, or what we might call naturalized citizenship today, The British did not. So if you were British, born in London, and you move to America, you get married, have a life, a family, and work, the British still say, still you are a British subject. You can't decide to break that for yourself. Only the king can break that allegiance. The Americans, however, would say, it's your choice. You're a free person. You can come here and decide to be a citizenship after a particular amount of waiting or whatever the rules were. Now, this is from the legal brief of Sir John Nicol, the King's Advocate General, sort of his Attorney General and main legal advisor. And he's writing on this subject for the purposes of the government in 1806, and this is in advance of an Anglo-American negotiations on impressment. And this is what he wrote on the issue. Individuals owe an allegiance and duty to the state of which they are natural-born subjects. From this allegiance and duty, they cannot, without the consent of the state or the king, release themselves. He even then went on to argue that any state or country that interfered with this, as the Americans were doing by allowing people to become naturalized citizens, were effectively committing an act of war. Now, adding insult to injury and further underlining the inferiority of American citizenship to British subjecthood, at least in British eyes, by the 1812, the Royal Navy was in practice held that anyone born in Britain, married to a Briton, or having lived in England for 2 years was a British subject and therefore eligible to be seized from a foreign ship and pressed into service aboard the Royal Navy. Britain's legal position, of course, was backed by the power of the Royal Navy, which was boasted nearly 600 warships. The Americans, on the other side of the token, had 20. So for many Americans, the situation of might makes right smacked of the old colonial relationship, leaving them, including the president and the majority in Congress, with the belief that the U.S. had little choice but to fight a war to protect its sovereignty. As one commentator complained in an 1812 4th of July oration, the impressment of American seamen had no foundation in law. Rather, it was a practice of, and this is from the oration, that lawless power who has capriciously substituted naval force for maritime right and imperiously claims the sole dominion of the ocean. Now, in this illustration, Columbia, which is the personification of the U.S. on the left, tells John Bull, the personification of Britain on the right, to learn respect for free trade and seamen's rights. Whereas John Bull simply responds, I don't like that lesson. I'll read this pretty lesson instead. And inscribed on his book are the words, might constitutes right. In short, the U.S. is for the rule of law, whereas Britain is a bully in need of a good drubbing. Americans naturally chafed at the idea of their former imperial masters awarding and denying rights to a sovereign American nation at their pleasure. Echoing declarations and denunciations in legislatures and newspapers across the U.S., President Madison explained to Congress in the autumn of 1812, and this is by way of justifying continuing the war and why they shouldn't negotiate, explained that to acknowledge Britain was right would be to invoke a series of policies that trampled American rights. And he argued that what this would have meant, and this is from Madison, that on the element which form 3/4 of the globe we inhabit, in other words, the oceans, and where all independent nations have equal and common rights, the American people would not be an independent people. Rather, they would be colonists and vassals. So failure to fight for America's self-determination, in this instance, he argued, would have violated the legacy of the American Revolution, and according to Madison, marked a fall from the high rank where the virtuous struggles of our fathers had placed us, and betrayed the magnificent legacy which we hold in trust for future generations. Thus, for Madison and his supporters, the War of 1812 was a second war of American independence. Now, to be fair, The Americans had very good reasons to be wary of Britain and fearful of any European infringements on their national sovereignty. European monarchies had recently demonstrated their willingness to use force against Republican movements and weaker nations. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, for example, had watched from their diplomatic posts in Paris and London in 1787 as the autocratic King of Prussia marched 20,000 troops into the Netherlands under the simple pretext that his sister had been insulted. In reality, he wanted to crush the Dutch Patriots movement for Republican reforms. They watched also as Poland, which reemerged as an independent nation under a new constitution in 1791, had been riddled by the same sort of factionalism that was plaguing the US at the time. And despite having a far more formidable military than the US, Poland was relatively easily partitioned and then absorbed by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The French rampage under the revolutionary and then Napoleonic governments through Europe, in which borders were repeatedly withdrawn, countries were erased and monarchies abolished and replaced. Serious challenges to the century-old system of the law of nations that emphasized national independence and autonomy were being made. And neutrality didn't make any difference, as the Danish had learned in 1807. So as much as we might make a big deal about the Chesapeake affair, the Danish had a much harder lesson. In 1807, when the Danish refused to hand over their own navy to the British, now the Danes are neutral, the British Royal Navy showed up and bombarded Copenhagen, killing thousands of people and destroying much of the city, just simply to force the country of Denmark to hand over its navy. And remember, Denmark was a neutral nation. From such widely reported incidents, Americans could take a valuable lesson. Being passive in the protection of one's national sovereignty invited aggression. Now, Britain was every bit a protagonist as the US was in the War of 1812. Like the US, the British government and its supporters across the empire had an agenda over which they were willing to go to war. That agenda, however, had been largely overlooked by scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a myth that the British, whether the people of the government, were so absorbed with fighting France they neither knew nor cared about the war with the US. Right? Really, it's the subsequent historians who didn't care, not the participants at the time. The truth is that British policies towards the US were neither ad hoc nor left to the management of those people on the ground. Policy was crafted in London and then administered through regular instructions to relevant officials abroad. The subject often topped the agenda of cabinet meetings and parliamentary debates. It also took central stage of official speeches by the Prince Regent, who had taken over for his ailing father, the king. Even the peace negotiations were micromanaged by the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, seen here. And he did this through puppet negotiators. In fact, he made the level of micromanagement clear in a letter to one of Britain's envoys, in which he said he would allow negotiators only to alter, and this is from his instructions, to alter a word or a phrase, provided they adhered to the substance of what we send you. American news also made headlines, regularly squeezing out France, as the Leeds Mercury reflected in the summer of 1812 as the nation waited to see if war would happen or be averted. This is what it wrote. The question of peace or war with America takes the presidency and public importance over all foreign news. The happiness and tranquility of this country are much more closely connected with this subject than with the victories in Spain or the movements of contending armies in France or Russia. Now, certainly there is no denying that the wars with France took center stage in Britain, right? It's not overwhelmingly shocking. Because in terms of expenditure of time, blood, and treasure, the wars with Napoleon and France dwarfed the one with Madison's. After all, the French wars cost the lives of 1 in 3 British males between the ages of 18 and 25, and national debts that would take almost a century to pay off. So that's serious. But, right, this is a big but, the American war still received quite a bit of attention, and probably a disproportionate amount of attention in terms of lives lost and treasure spent. That the Americans would not support the mother country was very upsetting and, in fact, galling to a lot of the people in Britain and around the empire. In the popular British imagination, at home and abroad, Napoleonic France was seen as a force of darkness, bent on the subjugation and tyrannical rule of all of humanity. As a Scottish paper declared in response to news of the American declaration of war, the French regime was a murderous despotism, led by the demigod of slaughter and infamy that laid waste to its conquests. In fact, this cartoon is just one of many that imagines what life would be like in Britain under French rule: chaotic, anarchic, and bloody. Britain, in sharp contrast, according to the newspaper, was the generous and enlightened country that for 5 years past has, almost single-handed and alone, opposed and defeated the hitherto overwhelming and invincible armies of France. Meanwhile, the paper complained, the Americans were meanly profiting from the situation. Now, while the British sacrificed their wealth and their sons for the sake of all humanity, so the argument went, the American government whined about Britain's tactics, namely its need to restrict French commerce and to secure the service of its own sailors. In short, the tedious, litigious complaints about legal precedent and practice be damned. And this is from the London Times. Engaged in a contest for liberty, a gift dearer than existence, Great Britain must have recourse without scruple to any measures it needs that can be used to preserve her independence. The measures, of course, were restrictions on American and other neutrals' trade and the ability to use impressment to keep their navy going. Now, this isn't to say that a large contingent of Britons wanted to reabsorb the United States into the empire, because they didn't. But they did want to see the U.S. accept a subordinate status to the British and to place itself within the sphere of British influence. If the Americans had a chip on their shoulder about being colonists, the British had an imperial one. There are plenty of comments in public and private along these lines, and I'm just going to give you one example. In August 1807, Sir George Cranfield Berkeley, who was the Vice Admiral and commander of the Royal Navy's North American station and ships, he sat down and devised a plan for a preemptive strike against the U.S., and then he sent it to his superiors in London. Berkeley had articulated the views that many in Britain had towards the U.S. in the years leading up to the War of 1812. He loathed the Americans. He called them the refuse of all countries. The dangers of their ignorance, he wrote, were multiplied by their illiteracy, which enabled men like Jefferson and Madison to manipulate the people. Americans all read, he sneered, and look upon everything as an oracle that is published in this way. And the more abusive, the more gratifying to the mind of an American. According to Berkeley, the American Revolution had emboldened the Americans above their station. A new war, he argued, would put them in their place. Berkeley's plan was intimidation followed by diplomacy. He said if he had a few more ships, he'd sail up to New York, threaten to bombard it. If they didn't start negotiating then he'd attach 5,000 troops to his squadron and go up and down the Atlantic seaboard, pillaging. His argument was, in 6 months of this sort of war, will raise such a clamor as will certainly oblige them to come to terms of peace and submission. So from the perspective of the British, they're looking at this sort of perspective of Madison, and Madison is increasingly kind of portrayed as this kind of mad person, and they would play on his name of Madison, so mad ass son. So mad being not angry, but sort of crazy, and he's continually portrayed as somewhat deranged. In this particular image, he's shown here between Napoleon and the devil, kind of jumping up and down like he's insane. And it becomes an increasingly sort of familiar mantra. The Americans are an unstable, unreliable sort of people. So from the perspective of the British imperial and overseas economic interest, the U.S. was an aggressive, expansionistic, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous opponent for the struggle for supremacy in North America. In fact, while the words such as inevitable may be a little bit too cavalier in a serious historical discussion, that the US and Britain would go to war in the early part of the 19th century was really more a case of when rather than if. In North America, the US represented a clear threat to the British. In 1803, the US had participated in what many in Britain considered to be a swindle of the Louisiana Territory from Spain. The US regularly attacked American Indian allies of the British and controversially acquired their lands. America also conducted operations against Spanish Florida as it backed rebels in Spanish Texas, and by the end of 1811 was openly preparing for an invasion of Canada. That Canada would be the US military's primary objective was perhaps the worst kept secret in military history. So at sea, in the space of a couple of decades, the American merchants had taken over much of the carrying trade between Europe and its colonies, undercutting British competitors, taking advantage of the safety that the Royal Navy had provided. While this benefited some, it hurt others in the empire, particularly the West Indian interests, the British planters and colonists in the Caribbean, whose Caribbean sugar and coffee trade surpassed the value of any other products in the British Empire, and whose merchants and planters had long enjoyed a lot of political influence in London. The first decade of the 19th century saw sugar prices drop from all-time highs to all-time lows as they lost access to European markets because of the war, and then come the Americans dumping tons of foreign sugar into the market, dropping the price of British sugar. British ship owners complained too because they're being undercut by American merchants because they had lower insurance rates and therefore could pay their sailors more and sell their products for less. So increasingly, the British were agitated by all these sorts of neutral laws that protected Americans at the expense of the British. And to do all this, making things worse, the Americans were taking away the very sailors who were the lifeblood of the Royal Navy, those wooden walls that protected Britain itself. And so by 1812, Britain's Royal Navy was the most powerful navy in the world. In fact, the most powerful navy the world had ever seen, but it needed 100,000 ships. In order to sustain its size during the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy needed 10,000 sailors a year. And this demand forced Britain to greatly extend the practice of impressment, both in terms of geography and people. Meanwhile, the government in Britain estimated that there were roughly 20,000 British subjects serving in the American merchant fleets. Allowing British subjects simply to denounce their allegiance and unilaterally claim American citizenship was unfathomable. In fact, the US did not allow its own citizens to actually do this. Yet the US government, which depended heavily on the taxes that's being generated by this trade, allowed it to continue. So the British government's objective in 1812 was clear: force the US to submit. And they put increasingly pressure on the US to choose either submission or fight for their rights. Now, Britain's plan for the subordination of the US crystallized during the War of 1812, and it became particularly apparent when they started negotiating. When the negotiators arrived at Ghent, the British unfurled this map. And the map, what they put together, made clear what their goals were. What they demanded from the Americans was the entire Great Lakes region. So the Americans, therefore, to lose a northern natural boundary. And they also wanted roughly 1/5 of US land to be handed over to their American Indian allies to form a Native American state, which essentially, for all intents and purposes, would be allied to the British. When John Quincy Adams, one of the delegates and a future president, asked at the convention what was to be done with 100,000 American citizens living in that territory, the British just simply dismissed him, and they scoffingly replied, "They must look after themselves." Had Britain succeeded, the US would have been squashed between a newly invigorated British Empire in the north, the Spanish in the south and west, and an American Indian state. Western expansion and manifest destiny would have been stumped, and America's position as a rival British power in the Atlantic would be squashed. The domestic repercussions for Madison and his party would have been fatal. Meanwhile, the British public clamored for regime change, increasingly depicting Madison as both mentally unstable and more like Napoleon. the British demanded that Madison be removed and replaced with a much more get-along sort of American puppet government. However, in the end, it was the British domestic politics rather than any great American feat on the battlefield or negotiating table that forced Britain to retreat from its position and offer the U.S. a very generous peace in December 1814. The decision actually came from a shock. Came as a shock to the Americans. After all, by this time, the American government was bankrupt, its army hadn't been paid, its navy was bottled up, its coastline was blockaded and harassed. The New England states were ultimately contemplating secession, or at least a withdrawal from the war. British troops were pouring into Canada, and the American capital lay in ruins, having been burnt by British troops. But, as this illustration shows, after over 2 decades of global war with France, the British people were tired of war, and they demanded demobilization of Britain's military machine and a massive reduction in taxes, making the continuation of the War of 1812 with America absolutely impossible. John Bull, seen here, had simply been bled dry by the demands of a generation of war. The Prime Minister knew this, and he knew he had until December 1814 to finish the war, and which is why he knew he had that much time to do it, because Parliament would return and demand a decrease in taxes. When the British weren't able to achieve their war aims by the end of 1814, he simply gave up and backtracked. For him to resist that and continue the war would have been political suicide. And so he directed his negotiators to offer a shockingly generous peace. So ultimately, in conclusion, who won? Well, the war may have ended without a declared victory, and the debate has raged ever since about who won. But contrary to sort of my predecessors, as well as in the interest of time, I'll give a precise answer. The United States won. Why? Well, both countries entered the war with an agenda. The U.S. government wanted respect as a sovereign nation via maritime rights and the end of impressment. Britain wanted to squash an emerging rival. Neither got what they wanted in the treaty, but Britain stood to lose considerably more by conceding its agenda. Within a generation, the U.S. would largely eliminate its remaining American Indian opponents, acquire the remnants of the Spanish Empire in North America, and grow at such a rate as to make Britain's empire in North America largely inconsequential to its future. In short, the War of 1812 represented for the U.S. a victory over British colonialism far more complete and lasting than the American War of Independence ever had.